Hi, and welcome back to the Computational Social Science and Digital Humanities Mini Symposium. Please allow me to introduce our next speaker, Laura Nelson. Laura Nelson is an assistant professor of sociology at Northeastern University, and today she will be talking about how Python, word embeddings, and visualizations can be used to gain insight into the social process of intersectionality. It's great that you're here today, Laura. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And what a wonderful track to be part of. I'm really super excited. Just get all this set up. All right, we're good to go here. All right, so I am going to talk about intersectionality today and using Python to measure intersectionality. There's a GitHub link there, my GitHub lknelson/measuring_intersectionality. Has all the code and a link to the paper if you want to follow along as well. I want to start by talking about what intersectionality is not, which is interaction effects. So in the social sciences, intersectionality has been most often measured quantitatively through interaction effects. So interacting race and gender, for example. That, in my eyes, does not capture intersectionality in the way that it was intended to be explored and analyzed. And I think we have the tools now with machine learning, of course, Python, to do so in a way that sticks much closer to the definition of intersectionality and the spirit of the theory as it was developed, both in the humanities and the social sciences. So what is intersectionality? It's a word or a concept, a theoretical framework that has been used across many different disciplines in the humanities and the social sciences. It's what's kind of known as a traveling theory. So it's been kind of used and modified across many different disciplines. So for the purposes of this talk and the way I use it in my work, I'll give you a precise definition. Intersectionality is a theoretical framework for understanding how social identities and categories combine with each other and interact with systems of social, cultural, economic, and political power to create distinct and unequal lived experiences. So I kind of put this piecemeal up to emphasize the different aspects of the definition of intersectionality and the fact that all parts of this definition are really important. So social identities and categories combine with one another and their interaction with systems of power to create these unequal lived experiences. You need those kind of three parts to really capture the theory of intersectionality and how it's used in humanities and the social sciences. So rather than interaction effects, I use machine learning to try to explore how these intersecting social identities interact with systems of power to create these lived experiences using a corpus of text from the 19th century US South. So the 19th century US South, I think it's not a nice period of history, but it's a nice period to illustrate how intersecting categories create these unequal lived experiences. So this picture is a little misleading. It's neither from the South or the 19th century. This is Chicago in 1913, but it kind of illustrates what that century was like in the United States, which is it highlighted or emphasized these intersecting experiences. So a Black woman did not experience this century the same as a white woman, certainly. A Black woman did not experience this century the same way as a Black man did. So this century is a nice one to explore intersectional experiences using machine learning on text produced. There was a lot of text produced during this period as well. And we know a lot about it. So historians have been doing some really great work understanding how Black women experience this century differently than Black men and white women, for example. And so we have a nice base of historical work to build on. So I'm not replacing this historical work, of course. I'm just providing a different lens, thinking about how we can use new tools and data to think differently or explore analytically in a data-driven way how these different experiences showed up in writings of people who lived through this century. So the corpus I use is called Documenting the American South. It's housed at the University of North Carolina, and it's a collection of primary sources, a lot of first-person narratives from people who aren't typically in the historical record, so women, laborers, low-level soldiers, enslaved people. And I use two collections here for a total of 414 novel length or book length first-person narratives. So the first-person narratives of the U.S. South and ex-slave narratives, and 41 by white women, 89 by white men, 48 by black women, and 243 by black men or about black persons. And I can talk about what that means if we want in the question and answer. So that's the corpus that I'm using to try to understand how different groups of people experienced this century. And the particular method I'm using is word embeddings, which is a kind of not newly, but for the past 5 years has been a pretty trendy way of looking at text. So the intuition behind word embedding models is to place words in their context, so to create a vector for each word rather than just treating it as a single word. So on the left here is Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. On the right is Machiavelli's The Prince. So if you were wondering how are these two books different, you can look at the frequency of the word working, for example, and Marx and Engels use the word working a lot more than Machiavelli did, but you can also look at the way they use the word, and you can compare the way they use the word by looking at the word in context. So the context in which Marx and Engels use the word working is very different than the context in which Machiavelli used the word working, and we know that by creating these kind of vector representations of the word and looking at it in vector space. So it's a relational approach to looking at words in context. And it's a predictive approach like most machine learning methods. So if you were giving the model the sociological imagination, it would try to predict the sequence of words. So in the skipgram model, for example, you give it D in imagination, and it tries to accurately predict that intervening word, sociological. The continuous bag of words model, you give it sociological, and it tries to predict the context, D in imagination. So that's how it builds these models up. So that's a brief kind of intuition behind word embeddings. I'm guessing many of you have some experience with them or knowledge of them here. So one of the early big word embedding models trained on Google Books by Google researchers used analogies. So you can read this as women are to sewing, as men are to carpentry, women are to nurse, as men are to surgeon. So this is the data-driven analogies that came out of this early word embedding model. And computer scientists saw this and they said, oh my gosh, this is picking up a lot of biases that we don't want to implement in our systems. So their initial response was, we need to debias word embedding models to make sure that these social and cultural biases don't get built into systems, which is correct, we need to do that. But social scientists and humanists said, wait a minute, this is great. This is a way to reveal intersecting systems of power. It can reveal the very social and cultural biases that are baked into our language and can perpetuate stereotypes and associations over time. So this was a very exciting moment for social scientists and humanists, saying, wow, this is really giving us a chance to lay bare how the very language we use every day contains these associations that are, for computer scientists, were problematic, but are very real for social scientists and humanists in a way that's very helpful analytically. So by using first-person narratives from, in my case, the 19th century US South, I'm using word embeddings to reveal the lived experience under intersecting systems of cultural and social and political power, to think about how, if you were a Black woman, you would have experienced this century differently if you were a white woman, for example. So this is, sorry, it's a lot of text here, but I'm trying to map the methods I use to the definition of intersectionality that I gave you in the beginning of this talk. So I want to map 4 combined social identities, Black and white men and women, with 4 social institutions: the polity, the economy, culture, and the domestic. And those come from classic sociological theory, which I'm happy to talk about more. This is, of course, not the only institutions and identities you could map, but that's what I'm doing. And I'm going to produce 4 visualizations showing the specific and relational position of each identity embedded within the social institutions as conveyed in the context of pro-abolitionist narratives from the 19th century US South. So just to be clear, this collection of text is not a random collection of text from the 19th century US South. It leans much more pro-abolitionist than a random sample would give us. So context is always important. This is largely pro-abolitionist. If you took a random sample of text, you would get much different results. So just want to make that clear here. So here, the libraries I use come standard libraries. I'm going to use sentence tokenizer and word tokenizer from NLTK. I'm going to create some random corpuses, so I use the random library. And the main word embedding library is GenSim, or GenSim has a word embedding implementation. So I'm using the GenSim library to build my word embedding models. First, tokenize by sentence, because I want to respect sentence boundaries. So you're looking at the word in the context, a window around the word. And the window I set is 5, so you can see the kind of parameters I set there. But I respect sentence boundaries, so I don't go over the sentence boundaries. So you first tokenize by sentence, then by words, and then you build the model using the word2vec implementation. And I'm using the skipgram model because it does better with smaller corpora, which is I have, and more rare words. So you can use that is one implementation in GenSim that I use there. And then I created 40 random models for constructing bootstrapped confidence intervals. And I just did that by taking the length of the main corpus, the number of sentences in the main corpus, randomly choosing the same number of sentences with replacement, training a new model on each one of these. So I have 40 random word embedding models trained on a kind of random selection of sentences, and that can create my 95% confidence interval for looking at differences between cosine similarity scores, for example. So when I show confidence intervals, it's that bootstrap method coming from these random corpuses created by random sampling. So how did I proceed here? So we can, with word embedding models, we can use vector addition. So you add 2 vectors together and you get a resultant. So to create the 4 social identities, I averaged over synonym pairs. I'll show some code in a bit. So to create the black women vector, I took each synonym pair from the women synonyms and the black synonyms, added them together, divided by the number of synonym pairs, and then added that vector back into the main model. So you can see these synonyms here. You just create a little function that says add all the synonym pairs, so women synonym, black synonym, and then you add the black women vector back into the main model. And you get this whole vector space where every word in the vector space is related to every other word, which you typically measure using angular distance, cosine similarity, including those 4 created vectors that I created. So you can do just like a little stiff test and say, what is the cosine similarity between black women, black men, and white men and dainty? And you see that white women are the closest to the dainty variable, and black men are much further away to the dainty word, sorry. So that's just a little test to say, all right, yeah, that white women should be closer to the dainty vector compared to black men. So we're good to go there. And then the context, so the institutional context, which is equally important and which is often missing in quantitative models of intersectionality when you're just using variables. So to create this, I just took the 50 vectors that were closest to these 4 social institution variables, and that's just simply using the most similar function in the GenSim library, in the word embedding library there. So you get a list of 50 words or 50 vectors that are closest to these 4 institutional vectors, and that creates that institutional backdrop to embed these social identities within. So to give a sense of just kind of what the discourse was like for these institutional backdrop here, the institutional variable, this is just a principal component analysis plot of these 4 institutions and the 50 words that have the closest cosine similarity. And just quickly interpreting these axes, on the left side here, on the x-axis, you get aspirational words like commonwealth, respectability, statesmanship, and on the right, you get very practical words like chores, milking, earnings, dues, and on the y-axis on the bottom is individual. So refinement is an individual aspirational word versus commonwealth, which is a collective aspirational word, and then debt is a collective practical thing, and milking is an individual practical thing. So this is kind of the discursive space that I'm embedding these social identities within. In the next slide, I'm going to embed the social identities with this in 4 scatter plots. So here we see the distance between the 4 social identities to these social institution words. And if this seems complex, that's on purpose, because to measure intersectionality, we need this complexity to be able to look at this relationally and embeddedness. So there's a lot going on here, but it's very much on purpose to try to show how intersectionality works. So what we can see here, for example, so we have distance to the culture vector versus economy, distance to culture versus polity, domestic economy, domestic polity. And what we see here is the culture words group by race. So it separates the races and it clusters the different genders within the race. So Black women and Black men are much further away from the culture vector than white women and white men. So culture distinguishes by race. We see domestic kind of does the opposite. It clusters by gender. So white women and Black women are much closer to the domestic vector compared to white men and Black men. So it's clustering, it's bringing the two races and the genders together and separating the genders apart. And the economy vector has this really interesting intersectional effect where it's bringing Black women and white men almost equally distant from the economy vector. So it's kind of pushing those two identities together, where it's pushing apart different identities. So the important thing here is that the relational distance between these social identities is dependent on the institutional context. What institution are you looking at? And that's going to change all the kind of relational distances between these identities. And that, I claim, is really what intersectionality is trying to pick up on. It's not about interaction effects. It's not that when you add gender and race, you get something different. It's really about looking at this relationally, contextually, and embeddedly. Now, we don't have to do it in this kind of complex way that takes a long time to explain. We can do a more standard statistical significance measure. So this is conveying the exact same information. It's just now points on a graph. And the 95% confidence interval is from that, those 40, it's a bootstrap method, right? It's from the 40 random corpuses I created. So here it's saying the same thing. Black women and white women are statistically significantly closer to the domestic vector compared to their same gender, or their opposite gender counterpart, Black men and white men. Culture is separating the races, so white women and white men are statistically significantly closer to the culture vector, and then we see this economy one, which there's almost no difference between white men and Black women on the economy vector here. So it's showing the same information, but just throwing some stats at it there. So what does this mean? Like, what does it mean that the culture separated the races and domestic separated by gender, and we have this intersectional experience of the economy? That means that when white people, white men and women, were described or describing themselves in this corpus, they were more likely to describe themselves in the context of these culture words that were determined in the word embedding model. So for example, here's a white man writing about his wife, and he describes her as erudite without pedantry, charitable without parade, soft of speech but duly assertive, stickler for the social proprieties but void of prudery, ever genial but never frivolous. So those cultural words are erudite, charitable, genial, void of prudery. So the way that white men and women either describe themselves or each other were using these high culture words, like gentility was really important in the US South to describe kind of white people in their position. And so you're more likely to see these types of words when describing the experience of white men and women. And this is compared to, for example, Black women, who were much more likely to describe themselves in relationship to the economy or be described in relationship to the economy. So describing a Black woman here, a previously enslaved woman, at the time of her death, she had acquired by her industry and care more than $400, the whole of which, after paying the expenses of her last sickness and funeral, she left by will to charitable purposes. So this is all over this corpus. You know, Black women had no choice but to work. They didn't have a choice not to work. They were either forced to when they were enslaved, or they had to for economic reasons after slavery ended. And so they're much more likely to be described, hey, she's a good woman because she works hard and she makes money, versus a white woman, she's a good woman because she has all of these cultural status markers. So that's how that translates. So that's how that's picking up these different experiences and different ways of living in the 19th century US South across these different institutional variables. And we could do the same exercise for polity, the economy, domestic, etc. But that's what that's capturing. So this is all, not surprising. I think historians of this century would say, yeah, we know that domestic, gender, culture, white people, etc. So I did one more institution just to kind of push this a little bit further to see what if it can give us any new information, and that is the relationship to authority. So slave rebellions were a perpetual fear by white populations in the US South. In some towns, some cities, the Black population outnumbered white people and certainly outstrength them in many locations. And so there was always this fear that there were going to be these, and there were slave rebellions all the time. And so there was some thought to how do we quell slave rebellions or make sure they don't happen. And there are two kind of theories about the relationship to authority as a discursive space during this period. One was that Black men were given an amount of authority, real authority and discursive authorities, particularly over Black women, partially because of the gender schemas of the time. Men should have power over women, partially because it was this idea that you could quell slave rebellions and make sure they don't happen. On the other side, white women had real power over Black men and Black women, and they could do whatever they wanted to them. So in that sense, white women should have more authority over both Black men and Black women. So I looked at the authority. I did the same exercise with authority. And what I found in this corpus is that it really upheld gender schemas. So Black men and white men were much closer to the authority vector. You see very little difference between white women, Black men, and white men and Black men. And Black men had discursive authority. They were closer discursively to the authority vector compared to white women. So it's really upholding gender schema and not racial schema here. So just in this last minute here, so substantively, what I found here is culture distinguished the races in terms of kind of the lived experience in this century. Domestic words distinguished by gender, not all that surprising. The economy had an interesting intersectional dynamic, which I found much more interesting. And even more interesting, authority discursively upheld traditional gender schemas, not racial schemas, which has been kind of an ongoing point of discussion about the history of this movement. Kind of more meta point here is just returning to my initial claim, interaction effects are not the same as intersectionality. They don't capture intersectionality. When we want to analyze intersectionality and then we have the new tools to do so, I think we can stick much closer to the original definition of intersectionality, which is a much more complex, embedded, contextual, etc. And machine learning gives us that ability to do it. So both machine learning and intersectionality are relational, they're embedded, they're situational, they're contextual, constitutive. Both are an inductive method, which may be a little bit more controversial. They're data-driven, uncertain, and interpretive. And when I say inductive, I mean even supervised machine learning is a mathematically fundamentally inductive method, which I would be happy to talk more about. And that's it. And I leave this with the Emerald Elysium, which is part plant, part animal, because that's what I feel like computational social science and scientists and computational humanists are. Not really plant, not really animal, but a nice combination of both there. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for this amazing talk. Really cool. There are already some questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to put them on the screen so we can all see them. Now they're jumping around. I'm going to start with this question. Some praise, awesome talk. No offense, but it feels like at times races in between Black and white, such as Hispanic, Latino, and Asian, are ignored. I wonder if there are any studies that either for or include people from these races as well. Thanks.
Yep, absolutely. So the corpus I was using in the time period I was studying, the 19th century US South, certainly Asians, people of Asian descent were there, Hispanic, Latino, absolutely. But it really was dominated by this Black-white divide. That was just the power of slavery. I mean, there was some like Irish were enslaved, right? And then in that sense, but it really became a Black-white thing. I think that the power of this method is it is extensible, and you can compare across context and compare across identities and social institutions, which is why I really love this method. So I would love for somebody to look in particular at Asians, because they were being brought over to work on the railroads, and there was a huge amount of discrimination against Chinese in particular. So yeah, absolutely extend it. It becomes a little bit tricky to capture those. I couldn't have done it with this corpus because it didn't include those voices, but a different corpus you certainly could. So I think what I am hoping is that more and more of these studies pop up using this, potentially this framework, to look at intersectionality across social identities, across social institutions, and build up this comparative framework to understand how it's different. I think that's absolutely the power of this method. So yeah, love it. More of it.
Perfect. Thank you. So moving on, this is a question by Mike Kestemont, putting on stage, or yeah, some compliments here. Again, this is one of the best talks I've ever seen on intersectionality.
Thank you.
I love how general the methodology is. It would be great to apply this to other languages, time periods too, antiquity, Middle Ages. So here's the question. You mentioned that these results, and I then think we have to go to the next one. You mentioned that the results would change with a non-random sample of text from the period. How exactly would they change the main trends that you described?
Yeah, they would be much more brutal to formerly enslaved or enslaved people in Black populations. It would be much, much more racist. You would not be seeing these kind of celebratory descriptions of Black women making money, and I didn't show very many quotes. There was these very long, entire books devoted to why Black people should have the same rights as white people. Absolutely, that is not random. You would just see much, much more racism. And that would be interesting. I would love to repeat this on a random sample or on a sample of like the kind of the more anti-abolitionist, which they were more popular at the time. So I think they would, I don't know how exactly it would change the main trends, but we would be seeing very different dynamics, and it would be much more caustic, much more racist than what we're seeing here. So a lot of the collection, a lot of the books in this corpus are really like, we need to give more rights. We need to get rid of slavery for one, and then give equal rights, because this is post-Reconstruction as well. We need to give more rights to formerly enslaved people. Yeah, it would be very different. And again, I think context is important, and that's what machine learning is really good at, right? It's trained on the corpus, so it's going to pick up the very dynamics in the specific corpus you're training on it. And a lot of machine learning people from a computer sciences want to make generalized models that will kind of go across different corpuses. In the social sciences and humanities, I think we can dig in and say, no, I want to know the dynamics of this particular corpus, do it again for another one, and then make those comparisons. And that will be really, really illuminating to how kind of different groups see and portray themselves. And so I think we should lean into the contextual dependency of machine learning, and that can give us a lot of analytic power.
Great. Thank you. Here's a short question. Hello, Laura. Have you uploaded any version of this draft in SSRN or Artif?
Yeah, sorry, it's behind a paywall. I did not upload a preprint, but if you email me, and the email is on the slides, or you can find me online, I'm very happy to send you a non-paywalled version of it. Sorry, it's paywalled.
So here's another question by Madikin. You mentioned that the text you sampled was from more abolitionist than a random sampling of language from the time. How would you expect your results to shift if you had a sampling that was closer to random sampling of the time?
So this is very similar to the previous question, and I would say the same thing. It would be racist. It would be terribly racist. It would be caustic. It would be terrible descriptions of. It would be very celebratory of white people and terrible descriptions of formerly enslaved people. So, perfect. Yeah, thanks. Very similar. Good question. So,
Adam says it's a fascinating work. Have you looked at how these metrics changed over time in your science?
I did. I don't have enough data. That was one of the first things I did, was try and see, like, because I cover the pre-Civil War, the Civil War, post-Civil War, Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction. So it's a fascinating time period that covers a ton of change. So the first thing I wanted to do was, how did this change, like pre and post-Civil War or pre and post-Reconstruction? I just don't have enough data. Word embedding models, you need at least 1 million words. And if I was going to train chunked on time, I would not have the number of words I needed to create a reliable model. More data. So if I could collect more and more data, I would love to do this temporal thing. You can do it with Google Books. You can't do it with a corpus of 414.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more question if we do that quickly. So here's a question. Given that this time period was chosen because of clear delineation between groups, what considerations/changes would you have to make to apply this to a more recent modern time period?
Yeah, the most important thing is in the time period I was studying, the words to indicate black and white were not black and white. They were Negro, Negress, African American. I'm white, I guess, but Caucasian. So those words are distinct. You can't use black and white. I mean, you'd have to use black and white in modern times, and those are also colors, right? They're actual colors. So it's very hard to pick up on those racial identities. So the paper Geometry of Culture in American Sociological Review found they couldn't do a racial analysis because of the fuzziness of black and white. They couldn't pick up that black identity as a social identity. They were picking up colors. So that's the biggest thing. And it's a huge, huge impediment. So we need to think carefully about how we would capture races. Asian actually would be easier, Asian and Latino, because of those words are distinctive. Getting the black-white difference in modern times is actually much, much more difficult. So I don't know, we need some creative thinking about how we would do that in modern times, specifically for black-white. We could do other races, but yeah, it gets buried. It gets buried in the color, the actual color, black and white.
Okay, and with that, I think we are at the end of the session. So let's thank Laura again with a lot of smileys and emoji and what have you. And we hope to see you back in, I think, 5 minutes for the next talk in our symposium. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the symposium.